welcome everybody. If we could just take a seat and get ready to start the session. Any more coming? Okay, well, welcome to this session, which is entitled Improving Regenerative Agriculture Through Open Source Technology. Welcome everyone in the room here in Oxford. Thanks for making it through the rain and resisting the temptations of dinner and the pub to be here. It's really nice to see you. And thanks everyone for joining online. Looking forward to comments and questions from you too. So yeah, and also I should say a special thanks to David as well, because he's just done another hour-and-a-half session in the main hall. So it's a real marathon for David this afternoon. Yeah, I'm really excited to be chairing this session. My name's Charlotte. I work for the Real Farming Trust, and my background prior to that is in kind of small-scale market gardening and running a veg box scheme. And so, yeah, it's my pleasure to welcome you all. And first, as there's just a couple, I've got a couple here on the panel, I'll introduce David and Dorn first, and then we'll move in, and then I'll pass the floor on to them. So we have Dorn here on my left. Dorn Cox is a farmer who's long been in the vanguard of regenerative agriculture and open source technologies, two ideas that are really rarely spoken in the same sentence. He's also a champion of participatory science and knowledge commons to help improve agricultural practices. He's author of this book, The Great Regeneration, Ecological Agriculture, Open Source Technology, and a Radical Vision of Hope, which is for sale on the Chelsea Green bookstall in the main hall. Grab yourself a copy. And he farms with his family on 250 acres in New Hampshire and serves as research director for the Schumacher Center for Agriculture and the Environment in Maine. Dorn is also a founder of the Farm OS software platform and Farm Hack, which hopefully we'll hear a bit more about later on. And so David Bollier is an activist, writer, and blogger who's focused on the commons as a paradigm for reimagining economics, politics, and culture. He's a director of the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics and has written, co-authored, or co-edited 12 books. And he's based in Massachusetts and just delivered, as I was saying, one of the sessions in the main hall. So I'm looking forward to building on some of those themes here in this session. And so just to kind of frame things a little bit before I hand over to the experts, Dorn and David's work both complement and complicate one another in as much as bringing together the dimension of the commons as it pertains to open source technology and regenerative agriculture necessarily opens up complex questions over transparency, participation, sharing, collaboration, accountability, and governance, just to name a few. And the language of the commons allows us to imagine and hopefully implement a transition to new decentralized and locally empowered systems of managing resources for collective benefit. So how this relates to regenerative agriculture, to food sovereignty, and to the applications of open source technology, both in the sense of software and also hardware, is complex, yet fascinating and inspiring. And I'm looking forward to a lively conversation between these two perspectives that have accomplished much in the field, but are also works in formation. And I think from my perspective, it'll be particularly interesting to hear examples from the US context that we can learn from and compare to where we're at here in the UK. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to Dorn.
Great, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here, and I should also note that it's also an honor to be here with David, who, although he's only lives a state away in the States, I get to see him here, and he was also the wrote the foreword for the book. And it's we don't actually have an opportunity to be in person all that often. But no, it's also great to be here in solidarity with the agroecology movement. And I've had the opportunity over the last decade to really see a lot of evolution and acceptance and mainstreaming of a lot of the ideas. It wasn't that long ago in the States where we weren't able to use the term soil health. I had people, friends, researchers and farms whose research projects were destroyed on university campuses as they were working on cover crops. And now we have a division of soil health in the United States. We now have recently allocated more than $19 billion in climate smart agricultural funds in the last Inflation Reduction Act in the state. So really radical shift, and yet it's still a drop in the bucket in terms of the role that we're playing and what we need to accomplish in terms of transforming our relationship with agriculture and the environment. And because that's really, that's at the foundation of what we're talking about. And what are the tools that we're going to do? What is the knowledge that we share in order to transform and provide the information and inspiration to actually help with that transition? So that's what this is about, though, is about what's the hope? What are the things that we can do? We can do a deep critique of the current system. We have it. That's what we're living. And so I think this conversation that that we're going to be entering in is sort of saying, what are the things that we can do today? What are the things that are already happening that will help move us along that? So I really think organizations like this, conferences like this that are happening across the state, across the world, and finding each other and finding common language and connectivity is incredibly important. And so that solidarity I think, is at the core. And I hope one of the core takeaways is that some of the tools that we develop can be a reflection of our best instincts. And so we don't have to take the current status quo as our only option, even when we're looking at really complex systems and the tools and technology that we use for communicating with one another. As I said, we're asking more of agriculture right now, which I think it's terrific. We're asking for all those invisible values, all those things that have been invisible but are valuable to us beyond food, fiber, and energy. Those are the commodities that are easy to see and to taste and to burn in your stove or to run airplanes or cars. But these other things that we're asking for are public goods, and those things are much harder to measure. And we're asking, again, for not just more production of those commodities. We're asking for stewardship of the environment and a different kind of story to tell and a different kind of relationship that we're asking for agriculture. Where this comes into the intersection with technology is that if we don't provide a means for quantifying that's actually held by those who produce it and can control it, it will also be enclosed. It will also be a tool for consolidation and centralization of power, even as it's used to improve the environment. It will not necessarily create regenerative livelihoods. So if we want control and we want better outcomes as we're transitioning to more regenerative landscapes, we also have to address the issue around the stewardship of the public goods, but also food sovereignty is data sovereignty. Because that's the commodity, that's the new tool that we have as producers, is as we're asking for more, whether we're producing more, not just more soil carbon or soil health, but biodiversity, or mitigating floods or drought, or increasing mitigating wildfires, increasing local or rural economic development, increasing the aesthetic value of the landscape. The economic development of our towns and cities are dependent on a lot of these aspects. The way in which we give voice to all of those is by measuring it and communicating it and telling stories that are defensible, that we can create contracts with each other and with the resources that we're improving. And again, if we don't tell that story, others will, and they're going to tell a different one. And so part of this is democratizing access and creating open access to control. Open access doesn't mean, this is important, again, public goods mean access to the global knowledge and the global knowledge commonwealth that we have around agriculture. But it's also about, again, local control and sovereignty. So this is not all theoretical. As I said, there's been substantial movements towards starting to value environmental environmental services and some of the other aspects that agriculture is producing. But also the tools and technology that are used to measure those are actually leading the way. Some of the communities that have developed around the creation of the commons, around the stewardship of our shared wavelengths, our spectrum, but also the internet itself points the way towards some of the community-governed organizations that actually steward some of that core infrastructure that makes this possible. And that has provided some of the scale and some of the governance and mechanisms and examples within our own generation. Because one of the things that we've seen in innovation is that these ideas need to be renewed every generation. And so I personally can talk about the ones that I've seen that sort of evolved over the last 15 to 20 years that include the Gathering for Open Ag Technology. You mentioned Farm Hack, so Gathering for Open Ag Tech grew out of actually Gathering for Open Science Hardware, which has its root in some of the larger open source software foundations for CERN in Switzerland that formed the foundation of the internet. So there's this lineage of some of these ideas in the contemporary world, but it goes back much further than that. But Farm Hack came and GOAT are directly related. Recently participated in an adjacent event called the Grassroots Innovation Assembly, which brought together about a dozen different organizations like Farm Hack from all over the world, all different continents, including the Honeybee Network in India, L'Atelier Paysan in France, CAPE in Canada, and many others. And each of those are, again, taking this concept of taking direct action and creating a different paradigm, a different story about how we treat information and what we put into that we become better stewards of the environment and create better tools that work better if we share and build on one another's innovation as part of the intent. And that essentially creates a positive feedback loop in that it's very difficult to then to move backwards from that when there's a sort of a core body of knowledge that is working. And that's sort of where we've seen the transition in internet technology, with Linux being the foundation of what makes everything work. Linux, Mozilla, Apache are now the foundation. And you can't really walk backwards from that. And so that's what we're hoping to get rolling. Also helped found an organization called Open Team, or Open Technology Ecosystem for Agricultural Management in the States, that's working directly with Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research and the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, and more than 60 other organizations that represent everything from smallholders to very large players in the agricultural space to help build this next generation of infrastructure that we need to create exchange and interoperability and communication and build the next economy that's based on improving the environment through our work in agriculture. And part of that are other organizations that I think will be presenting, like the Open Food Network, but also organizations like Hilo, which is an open source alternative to Facebook for community organizing that's based, rather than on sort of attention economy, it's around pro-social principles and how do we actually elevate regional community governance and support. But other organizations that we'll probably touch on in the discussion with David, like Zero Foodprint, which are creating examples for transformational finance, where it's essentially, rather than waiting for government funding for climate action, creating new kinds of agreements directly with food system providers to put money directly into locally governed funds for direct assistance for land stewards to take action in improving regenerative agriculture. So, and a common theme that I've observed with Open Team and each of these other organizations that all have a shared lineage is that they're, and David spoke about it a little in his talk earlier, is that part of the motivation is not just transactional. There's something else that people get out of being involved in contributing and sharing. Sometimes it's described, people always want to talk about capital, but really it's about a different mode of exchange. It's about a gift and reciprocity, and the mutual reciprocity that we create when we contribute back to the community. And so a lot of this is asking participants, both individuals but also organizations, to put something in. And that collectively we create something that's better, and we can solve much more difficult problems when we're asking questions together. Because what we found, even as we're looking across scales and geographies and cultures, is that we can agree on a lot of questions, even if we're having a hard time agreeing on what the answers are. But if we can focus on, let's solve hard questions, we can move towards creating solutions and tools and technologies that actually address those questions. And then we can debate about the data that we generated together. But it's a really important principle. And it is, again, based less on transaction and more on modes of exchange and reciprocity. And some of the other patterns that we're seeing, again, is that and I've been maybe shocked that the more we get into it, the more it becomes creating an alternative set of community governance tools that are both intensely local and global and then interaction, and then also bridging from the conventional capitalist structures that we're living with and building it's not off the top of my head, this alternative polis, this community governance organizations that are actually holding and stewarding a lot of this organization and empowering that process. And so there are different names for that. There's transformational finance is something we're talking a lot about in terms of how we're bringing resources in, using them through this process, and then releasing the tools, the technologies, and the ideas with new guidelines, under new licenses. And again, we're seeing that this transformation, again, exists, but it doesn't need to exist in the shadows. We can actually recognize it as a legitimate, scalable way to build complex things in the world that actually is already doing a lot of our work. We just have a hard time describing it or acknowledging that this process actually exists, has value, and can do really big things quickly. I will close in a moment and hand it over to Dave. I'll just note that one of the things that has also surprised me in the last couple years is that the role, we heard a lot in the last session about charters, and that's becoming increasingly important too, is the social contracts that we're starting to create with one another, and creating not just sort of the charters for what we're doing as a group and that having power, and you don't require any permission to get a group together and give it a name and create a charter for why we're together. What are we doing? What are we trying to accomplish together that we can't do individually? But also that we can hold each other accountable. And so that's what oaths of care and agreements and individual contracts that we can make with one another that by themselves aren't enforceable, but can be referenced, and we can use and build tools according to those specifications. There's a principle called FAIR, or findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And those are things that we can now require developers or tool makers to build into their products. You're seeing this with with right to repair and so forth. But these are things that we can actually enforce ourselves. And so I guess I'll close with just saying that I'm incredibly hopeful. We have a lot of the tools at our fingertips. I sort of like to think of it as a metaphor that, well, first that, in some sense, it's one of the most simple things that we have on Earth, because it's what, stewarding our land is what created the livable atmosphere in the first place. We just need to insert ourselves productively in that. But we have, for more than any time in the human history, we can describe what's happening and the peril that we've created through those tools and technologies. But we can also flip that around and use them. And so I like to think of this as like, we've built, 99% of the racing bicycle, but we just need to attach the chain. So I think I'll leave it with that, and we can hopefully dive into dialogue, both with the two of us, but also engage in Q&A and hear your questions and comments.
Well, I was fascinated to learn of Dorn's work with his many colleagues on digital technologies in agriculture, because it was a whole frontier, a whole vector of innovation that I was unfamiliar with, but I was very familiar with digital technologies, intellectual property, and commons. And this was another arena in which some of those dynamics were playing out in. But just to be a little more concrete about some of the technologies that were affecting agriculture, things like data sharing and data analytics, networking of information, collaborative sharing of information and co-learning. As he mentioned farm hack and Cosmo local production, where the design and knowledge is shared at one level, but it locally produced the physical stuff locally. And citizen science, I mean, there's a lot Dorn can go on more about some of those specific things that are mentioned in his book. But while some traditionalists would say, well, agriculture doesn't need that, I think it absolutely needs to engage with it both defensively, because big tech and big ag is adopting it and has its own terms for what they want to use, but also proactively so that it can be crafted to meet the needs of smallholder progressive agriculture. And that's where the intersection of that form of agriculture and open source, for me, was just so exciting, because open source is not something that's merely shareable. It has a whole cluster of political and social implications. Can the code be reused and modified and shared at no cost? Or is it going to be closed and proprietary, the way Microsoft and the big tech players make it? This has enormous implications for how much it'll cost, how customizable and useful it'll be, or whether you'll get locked in to somebody else's alien agenda. And this was the whole history of free software before it became modified into open source software. It was about freedom. And so there's really some profound dimensions to how these technologies evolve and get designed. And so that open source has certain advantages in that it has democratic participation in how it gets developed. It has the sharing of knowledge and collaboration in developing it. It has transparency and accountability that everybody can use. And it has flexible innovation that can constantly be updated and customized as new needs occur, all of which are not necessarily present in proprietary software. So there's kind of an inflection point here where if agriculture is going to be using these technologies, it should have its eyes wide open about what it's getting into and what are the ramifications of it for improving, customizing and adapting it for one's use, collective interest versus the big proprietary agricultural players, and so forth. So I think that was the initial part of the conversation that Dorn and I have had in the past. But then I brought some of the issues of the commons to play about how self-organized systems of commons can be more effective, responsible stewards of collective interest than simply going to the vendors and buying the stuff off the shelf. One, and two, we can develop more our own infrastructures and systems ourselves that we can control, which is what Dorn's many projects are all about, is trying to adapt these technologies as infrastructures we own, as opposed to infrastructures that government may or may not provide, or infrastructure that Google and Microsoft and others may own and can tell you what to do with. Not to mention those infrastructures being conduits for the sucking up of your data and personal information, and essentially disempowering you and making you a controlled consumer of their products, the way in other sectors of the economy it happens. So, I mean, I guess that would be my preface for how I want to get into this conversation and some of the issues. And I'll just reference some problems or complications that are the doors into a larger discussion. One is proprietary control by big tech versus open source principles, one. Two, open source and open platforms versus commons, because often having the information or code or data open, while it's a huge advance over it being privately controlled, it also makes it ripe for control by corporate players, the way Google and Apple have done in so many sectors. So in some ways, open is an advance, but commons is better. Can we have a dialogue about that? And three, digital networks can be enormously powerful in aggregating network knowledge and facilitating collaboration, but it can also be a force for default homogenization of global norms overriding what local wants to do. And I see a tension there that the local could be eclipsed, or certain niche sectors eclipsed, because the larger system, whether it's controlled by tech, big tech, or by even some of the groups that Dorn is working with, could not be as mindful of the local, or the local may not have its own resources to express themselves and use the technology in ways that are fitting for them. So, so that's three, and then a fourth issue that we can get into, I think, is how the very epistemology of modern science and IT may be not the full vision that we want to achieve. If you think of the ethic of, say, Wendell Berry, the farmer poet, or other localists, the whole idea of instrumentalist techno-solutionism is kind of anathema to a deeper relationship with the land and listening to it, as opposed to simply using the tools to extract more efficiently. So these are some tensions or problems that I think shoot through a lot of the issues that Dorn is grappling with. But why don't we stop here and open it up to some conversations by both Charlotte and the audience.
Great, thank you very much. It's fascinating, and I'm sure, yeah, we'll get into some of those conundrums over the next however long we've got. I wonder, maybe it would be good to just take a minute or two to kind of hand over to you to turn to your neighbour or neighbours and just chat for a minute or two and about something that you've heard here that resonates or piqued your interest, or something that you brought into the room that might kind of help to frame a question that you have or a discussion point that we could pick up. So yeah, let's just break for just a minute or two, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Okay, great. Thank you. It's good to see so many lively conversations going on. So yeah, I think what we'll do now is open the floor out for questions. We've got an online audience as well, so we'll kind of alternate between questions from the floor here and online. We don't have a helper for the roving mic, so I'm going to do my best to work around the room. But if it doesn't work, you'll maybe just have to shout, and we'll do it that way. But yeah, we'll take a few questions from the floor here, and if you feel like it when you ask the question, introduce yourself. It would be great to know who you are. Oh, you're going to do them. Thank you. Okay, this gentleman here, please. Oh, and just to say, I'll take 2 or 3 probably at once and aggregate them. So yeah, if other people have questions, yeah.
Right. I feel very passionately about this topic, so this question is going to come out as a bit rambling. My angle on it is I work on open source machinery for textile processing. So what you're doing in agriculture, more take it, from the food side more to the farming, from the food side to the textile side. And I guess my question is really around livelihoods, around people who work on open source, and especially sort of going on to this idea of the parallel polis that I think David sort of mentioned. And before I form my question, I just want to nuance the relation between big tech and open source, because it's actually very complex. Because a lot of open source software is actually developed by developers working for big tech. And that's kind of why it works, because they fund the work, and the best developers want to work for big tech because they can work on open source software. So that really complicates this question of livelihood around open source, because they essentially can do it for free. But my question more directly is to get into the nitty-gritty of sort of this parallel polis. Do you imagine a system where, say, a contribution to open source would give you a credit to spend on a tomato from your local sort of producer, as it were?
Could we pass the mic over here, please?
Thanks. We are both flower farmers, and we're also using open source technology to develop routes to market. We are at the very early stages of developing a relationship with an open source provider they've been very helpful, but we have found that while we're trying to engage with them and communicate our needs to them, we are quite often meeting a kind of resistance, because we feel that we are so small and such small fry. And yet it's really interesting to hear you both say, the focus is on local. And that's not our experience at the moment. That's not how it's been. I'm interested to know your thoughts on that.
Is there anyone else waiting a moment? Okay, yeah, just here, please, and then.
Hi, I'm also working on textiles, so it's a lot of that knowledge to develop linen and hemp and so on has been lost in Europe, and there's a huge amount of knowledge that people need to start on-farm processing or start developing textiles. So I'm trying to create start a knowledge commons, so to gather that information together. So my question's around that tension between, is it open source, is it commons, what are the rules to entry? I mean, I see it as like values are the rules to entry for that knowledge, which would be probably seen in the form of a charter, but then how do you actually regulate that in practice if you want people to have access to this knowledge easily, and you don't want to put money on it? Or I was wondering if you've got any ideas about what formats people can actually access knowledge via.
Can we start with these? These are great. And I think there's a really nice thread between them. Because I'd like to actually start, it's great that you're starting with textiles, because one of the first big open source sort of collaborative publishing projects was the Encyclopedia, with Diderot, which is Encyclopedia of Practical Farm Devices. Really, it was sort of crowdsourced, like 20,000 articles, thousands of authors contributing, sort of the precursor to Wikipedia, but it was really focused on practical mechanical knowledge and trades, documentation of the trades. And so I feel like, and that was at the advent of the printing press. I think it was one of the most published documents at the time. And so I feel like this is, again, knowledge is generational, and there was an attempt, and it feels like it's come back every few hundred, there's sort of a cycle of coming back with these ideas with new tools and technologies to create public access to it. And I think that's one of the things we're still facing, is this sort of democratization of access to knowledge, and sort of the definition of the internet as opposed to broadband, which is more the hardware. But if we're talking about the internet, it's access to all of our shared knowledge, and what does that look like? And is it really accessible in different languages and geographies and cultures? So I think that's more of a question, but I think the way to get to that is essentially is to start with the tools that we have and the concept that we're trying to achieve with a community behind it that has an interest in supporting it. And then in terms of the incentives, and we'll get back to, I think, the local feedback to that, because I think that's really important. But there are several ways in terms of livelihoods that I think are important, because again, you can't feed a family on a really high social standing and all the social credit that you get and the notoriety. And often, actually, some of the leading developers of open technology are not wealthy people. But they, through Herculean efforts, have really taken this on. So there's social goods, but that is important. That exchange is still important, so you can't just discount that. But there are other mechanisms and new business models that are working and can work to support, that have, you said sort of from the capitalist side, they have really embraced open source because it costs less, you get better code, and it's going to work and create much more complex systems that are going to be maintainable over time. So there's sort of a straight up sort of way in which we've gotten a lot of where we are. That's not the only way forward, in my view. That's where transformational finance comes in, and some of the larger organizations like Linux Foundation have started to create that, but this is something we're really working a lot on right now, is how do we bring multiple types of capital, whether it's a corporation that is actually misaligned with your underlying mission but wants the product, contribute funds but does not have input into the prioritization of how it's actually done or maintained. And so, but is making a contribution to the commons and the commonwealth, even while they have their own profit motive. So I think the transformational finance, and that's the community governance piece, is making sure that the funds come in from a foundation, from a government, from individual contributions, but are managed through a community process that actually, and we're going to get to this local side, because what we're also finding is some of this is, so the nuance of these things are sort of really is a huge range. Some are just, we have a new idea and it's conceptual and it's going to take a lot of resources over a long period of time. Sometimes it's just maintenance and you just need a little small change, or sometimes it's developing small features or things like that. Those are actually very different problems when we come to funding and governing those investments. So that's where creating community-based funding mechanisms that maintain that have access to that funding, the sustained funding over time, that can actually make those investments and pay the developers and those who are doing the work fair wages to contribute and get the social benefit. Because what we're also seeing is there's a lot of disaffected technology workers in the world that would much rather be doing things that are more meaningful with their lives. The other thing is creating new and better licenses. Our patent and intellectual property system is incredibly archaic and counterproductive and does not at all match up with the nuance of what we're trying to achieve with what we're developing. And this is true across the board, but in agriculture, in particular, it isn't just a matter of open or closed. I think that there's conditional use that's really important. And to get into that, Creative Commons has a little bit of this with non-commercial use as an option, but even the incompatibility of licenses is a big barrier. So there are organizations that we're working with to say, what does it look like to create a much more human-readable contract for how the tools are used and reproduced and added to and so forth. So so we can come back to that, but I'm also happy to follow up afterwards. But and finally, the accountability issue, I think, is part of that community governance, is that some of these issues are global and everybody has the same problem and we need to be working on. Some of them are intensely local. But I think most of when you're solving a problem that's just your problem locally, it is very high likelihood that somebody somewhere else on Earth, probably a lot of people, have exactly the same issue also. So it's really a matter, again, of this global, local dynamic of how do you find each other, and even if you're speaking a different language, how do you say we have the same problem, and if we invest together, our risk is far lower, and we're going to get something that's going to be better, and it's contributing, and over time, we are co-owners in that solution. And then you have a community rather than that will be there over time to help support that. So that's the vision, again, is that the solution is, again, through connectivity and solidarity and communications, which we can now do it incredibly, but it doesn't happen automatically. There's actually a lot of infrastructure that has to be built to do that, which also is sort of, that's what adds to the complexity. You can't just jump to, you can't jump to the end of the maze. You actually have to walk through every step.
Well, the three questions raise, I think, some really difficult, intractable issues. And I was reflecting on it as Dorn was talking. I think the basic problem is that we don't have the conceptual vocabulary for talking about commons-based infrastructure. And so we default into philanthropy, sweat equity, or corporate investment. And I think the case needs to be made more strongly and articulately that this is an investment in collective infrastructure that makes all of our lives easier, cheaper, and we need to find revenue finance sources for that. And I don't know enough about the transformational finance project on how that works, but in my thinking about this, we need to make that case. First of all, this is why this is infrastructure. It's not just help me do this one project. And I think you can do things like the affiliated foundations that most open source communities have, which can be conduits for raising money and channeling it to the most strategic uses within the open source community. I think there can be institutional partners that can provide in-kind support or actual money to help build this infrastructure, because you might have mutual interest, but coming from different angles. Philanthropy should become more enlightened on this, that some of their bucks are not simply like funding operational stuff, but it's funding this long-term infrastructure that will create a community with innumerable positive spin-off effects. And it will be the most effective way they could spend that philanthropic money. And so that case needs to be made. I don't know how much philanthropy, institutional philanthropy, understands that.
And it's a really great point, because we're also talking to some of the foundations that work with us and say, actually, our community is probably going to source better projects than your program officers are. You should create a process by which they're actually elevating on a regular basis and allocate a portion of your funds to that process and commit to it. So that's part of the case that we're making.
I'll talk of two cases which illuminate this weird, tricky tension. One is, I talked to this fellow, if anybody here knows more about this, fill me in the rest of the story, but the EU apparently needed some help from an open source community on data security. And the open source community knew a lot of this because that's the way they worked. Whereas the EU bureaucracies couldn't couldn't develop this and didn't know as much. They were not as expert and so forth. So how could you have a productive relationship between that community and the EU? Maybe through procurement, but maybe the procurement doesn't, how does an open source community be seen as responsible? And anyways, there's complications, but in that little parable, I think is the quandary for how, the EU wanted something of value that community could provide, but we don't have normalized procedures for funding that. And then I think of a related story. Dmitry Kleiner, a German hacker, developed this idea of transvestment, in which an open source community could create something of value by its very governance and construction and social norms in a way that a proprietary software company could not do. And so he envisioned maybe some of these companies would give money to transvest money to that open source community for it to do its thing on its terms with certain contractual agreements. And it would be kind of the best of both worlds, but it would not simply be a pure transaction. That community would continue to have its autonomy and sovereignty in how it run itself, but it would create something of value that could be monetized.
And I'll just give you an example where some of this process is happening in the States, but again with an eye towards sort of the global soil health movement, actually. So FarmOS was a software platform that started really to say, how do we, if we were going to do on-farm research on multiple farms, in our case, we did a lot of work with the Pennsylvania Association of Sustainable Ag and saying, well, what works? How do we compare our results to somebody else's across production systems, across regions? So we really built the software system for that purpose. It is now, after more than 10 years of maturity, with very minimal funding from a lot of the folks who are actually using it, has now been, and through that maturity process, now been adopted as the core architecture for gathering data for USDA soil health practices, both in their research program, but they're now going through building a new global soil health network that will be creating standards for laboratory data, for delivery of the data directly to the individual producer, to make it easier for individuals to share their results with each other and to benchmark their performance. But once that infrastructure is built, and USDA is now paying for a lot of that open source software, it allows us to do other things with it. So they are not in control of it, even though they have helped create and fund a lot of the core standards that will allow us to start to compare not just our soil health results, but also do price comparisons, to also do benchmark cost of commodities, development of our availability of local products for our within our local supply chains. All of those things are actually share a lot of the same underlying tools. But we're seeing, again, this has gone from niche, very sort of, or even fringe software projects to being adopted in some of the largest investments into agricultural research in the States. And as we have these standards, we can harmonize those with global soil standards to be able to share, again, not just locally or within our own countries, but start to compare across that in the global context.
Thank you. I'll take some questions from the online room. There's a few here. So the first one is, where's it gone? Oh yeah. So people are perhaps used to jealously guarding their intellectual property. How easy is it to persuade people that sharing ideas and information is good? So that one's from Diana Smith. I'll do two more. The next one from, where was it? Oh yeah, Janice Wong. There are talks about open source technology. What about open data? I tried to get hold of farm data to do modeling for Regen, but most data exists in farmers' desktops and there's no API available. And then the last one is from Naomi Barnes, and it's which data set would be the most useful to collect for a small-scale producer using regen farming techniques? Are you okay with those? Want me to summarize?
I'll defer to Dorn on the data sets, because that's...
So yeah, and you might want to jump in on the sort of the incentives for sharing, but I'll maybe take that first and see if you want to then jump into the data. Yeah, I mean the incentives for sharing I think really depend, but it is I think is it's about value and trust, and I think the core there is shifting the transactional the transactional nature of that exchange into more of a relational exchange, and that is not an intuitive transition for a lot of people to have that trust. So I think that's again why it's really important that who they're sharing their data with and what it's going to be used for is really an important part of the equation. And why we see organizations like this or existing cooperatives or community-based organizations as playing an increasingly important role in being stewards. And I mentioned earlier the importance of sort of creating new social contracts and an oath of care. One of those is for ag data professionals that we've developed. And we looked at a lot of other sort of oaths, but that we feel that organizations and people who are handling your data are in a sensitive position, just like an attorney is, or someone like a financial advisor. They all take oaths of care. Your doctors take oaths of care and have very strict regulations about how they share your health data. We think that that's really important, and that those roles should be respected and really elevated. And it's not a new role or even a new type of trust. This is it goes back as far as the concept of extension in terms of people who are involved in taking information about one place and helping to bring it to inform others in other areas. But it is about trust. So I think creating those social contracts and those assumptions is important, and it's one of the reasons we also, part of that suite of documents is an Ag Data Bill of Rights. And then the technology to support that is what we're calling an Ag Data Wallet, which essentially gives individual control of your data. So you're not actually even giving up your data other than for how somebody is going to productively use it. This is what I was saying, this conditional use agreement. You can take my data and do something with it, like model, or aggregate or get something back because I'm interested in getting information about my soil performance compared to the rest of the folks in the group, or I'm willing to contribute my information to the commons because I'm interested in building our public understanding of biodiversity and climate, and that's a contribution, but it can only be used for that purpose. So that's where I think there is an exchange, but it's one built on trust. And so all of this is again is possible, but it requires an investment of the participants in the process to support those agreements, those contracts, and then the technology that is actually built to do that.
That's a nice segue to talk about the difference between an open platform or an open data versus a data commons. And I think the point being that a commons will be more of a regime for trust, relationality, control, and critically, inalienability. And it's not going to be for sale down the road, all of which can engender trust in a way that if you simply make it an open access regime in which, who knows, 3 years from now, somebody's going to roll in, take it all up, and monetize it for themselves. So I think that it's the degree that you can help engender that trust by showing that somebody else is not going to profit off of your labor, and that this is a community dedicated to a certain mission, and there could be a market dimension to that, but it has a larger mission to which people are committed to, and that has to be cultivated. So, because one of the current problems with open access scholarly publishing, by analogy, is that people think, oh, it's open, that's all we need to do. And of course, that's drying up the well of goodwill. The commercial publishers are simply taking that open access scholarship and making a lot of money off of it by claiming by publishing it in print. So I'm just elaborating on the point about engendering trust.
Yeah, and creating mechanisms by which the assumption isn't just automatic centralization of that data, but actually creating, if we're creating value of that data, creating mechanisms by which individuals have control of how that's used. And I would say that, I'll just note here again why it's important to have cooperative organizations and community-based organizations, because this is a lot for any individual to manage. All the technology that's related to stewarding a new kind of income, a new kind of resource that we're creating on our farms. And so that's where, again, I think if we're thinking about land stewards, we're thinking about, in agriculture, we're not thinking about it as an individual enterprise, but it's a shared multi-generational community endeavor. And that includes not just land stewards, but ag data professionals who are stewarding the information about the land that make those claims possible and that are in partnership and in trust. So cooperatives, just like we've had grain elevators or other large infrastructure that where there's a history of agricultural cooperatives, we're now seeing that same opportunity for stewarding the information related to the environment. And this is the same kind of organization that can steward land itself. So this same data that we're collecting can give autonomy to the nature that lives there. Essentially, if we're talking about rights of nature, we can create not just the land trust, but the land trust that is actually beholden to the water quality, the quality of the river, the quality of the soil, the health of the forests. Those are all entities that can be built out of, can create a voice. Instead of being headless, they can have presence, both in the legal system, but also create a way in which we can have an official relationship.
Are you suggesting that the data then becomes a performance or legal metric for the trust?
Exactly.
Whoa, I had not heard of that. Okay.
So, again, the key is that data is, again, generated and becomes part of that public record for basing contracts on. So I think that's again, to enable this next generation economy, I think, like we said, we need new language, but we also need to reconceive or revitalize existing cooperative organizations and what we take on as community-based organizations, and in recognizing that we have the opportunity to take on more trust. And there are examples, like in Australia, the Regen Farmers Mutual is doing just this. It's an agricultural data cooperative using these same structures of data sovereignty, but providing income to producers, land stewards in the form of environmental payments, but managing that on their behalf, rather than, again, the alternative, which is sort of consolidation and enclosure. So I guess we've gone quite a bit on that. I can come back to the API and what data briefly. So that's actually one of the main projects that's happening in the States right now, is a project called a sort of a national calibration data set, which would be contributed in a common format that would be accessible so that those who are interested in referencing it have trust in that. And so that the idea there is that, and we've been talking, across not just USDA funding, but other private research funding, that we have some data conventions and protocols that, if followed, allow that data to be accepted and aggregated to be referenceable in the same structure so that that API that she mentioned works. So that goes in, so and you can note, she can follow up with me after if she's interested in that. So that, but there's the key word that we're working through is called is interoperability, which is just translation between how different people say different things. But there's a huge amount of work in that and a huge amount of maintenance in, especially as our vocabularies in describing complex environmental systems change and are very specific. So there's a massive effort underway to do just that. And what data is a key part of that. So we're looking at filling in some of those data gaps, especially with livestock systems and so forth. But it basically comes down to what did you do and how did the environment change? That's what we're asking questions about what works in different locations. So that's your soil and climate information, and then describing your management in your management system and how you did, whether you did tillage or you planted a cover crop. How did you do that? When did you do that? All the details of that are really important to be able to compare, just like you would with your neighbor, but to be able to compare with more people. And that's sort of the foundation of the first question, which is how do we create these data sets that are comparable? So fairly technical question, but I love it.
Thank you. Okay, we'll come back to the floor here. Do we have the roving mic? Oh, great. Okay, so first in front. If you got it, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm a total noob to this subject, so excuse me if I say naive things, but yeah, I'm a designer by background, and I spent a lot of my working career working with various 3D modeling software pieces, but more recently in my career I've become involved in the kind of agro-ecological scene. And there's a relationship between, a farm, or if you imagine a farm system is essentially a three-dimensional ecological system of interactions that is occurring, and there's a whole load of things that we see and that we don't see that produce yields of all on a series of different wavelengths. But as a designer, one tool that we use a lot is like 3D modeling sort of software on the computer, so that you can represent ideas. And there are a couple of programs that are really well known that are open source. Although, having referenced what you said, some of them are now starting to kind of say, oh, we need to start asking people for money because we've got to this point. But there's one particular program where people are able, because it's open source, the founder of the organization, he's kind of openly said, I'm not interested in money, I'm interested in giving people the tools that they can have to be creative without having to spend an enormous amount of money to be able to present their ideas. And it's also provided a platform for loads of other people to create plugins for that piece of software that acts as a kind of platform. And these plugins are also specific, and there's thousands of them, and there's a whole kind of economy based on the community that uses that particular piece of software. So you can get a plugin that will manipulate a 3D geometry in a procedural way to create a guild of plants, for example, that might work together or something. And I'm just really reflecting on what you're saying, because I'm trying to imagine in my mind and visualize what this world that you guys are conceptualizing looks like, and I guess I don't know. So that's kind of a commentary on maybe a parallel between what my experience is and what you're describing. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Okay, thanks. We'll take one at the back, please. Thank you.
Hi, just really quick question, and just want you to reflect on the sort of, maybe let's call it extraction implications of data and digital tech and all of that, just in terms of whether that is something that you also discuss as part of the whole, developing open source digital tools for getting all this data. And I agree, we needed probably, in the medium term. But there seems to be an issue around the energy consumption and the implications of mining on like kind of going with that whole paradigm.
Okay, thanks. Can take one more. Down here, please. Check shirt.
Thank you. John Turner, I'm a farmer and we're involved in a diverse grains project in the UK. My question is about, from what we've heard, the social contract that lives alongside the either open source or commons technology is as important. Getting a good match between the social contract about its use and the technology is really important. So for somebody who, maybe the open source element, the technology element is well known. Where do we start in terms of writing that social contract? Does it need to be implicit or explicit? Are there templates out there, or where would we start on that journey?
Yeah, I'll start with that. So we have a start, version 1 that emerged through the open team process. And that's a participatory process. Those template contracts are on the openteam.contract.community, I think. I can get, and those will be revised on, I think, either annual or semi-annual basis based on feedback from community members like yourself. So the intent is to create these artifacts that are created by those who are going to use them as well. And so so that's a big part of our sort of social infrastructure, is to create that feedback to make sure that the documents that are in use are ones that reflect the values of those that are creating them. And the first drafts were really came from, and the impetus was really from a very similar kind of organization to this called the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Ag. And they were saying, our farmers need this. So that's the first draft, I guess, and that's the data use agreement, it's the oath of care, it's a bunch of terms and definitions, it's a proxy agreement for assigning your rights to other trusted organizations or other farmers on your behalf. So those are some of the core pieces that we've started with on that side. And would love to have, this is how it works, is if you have a need and are able to participate, this is how it moves forward. So I'd love to connect on that. And we actually, I think that one of the other, and that actually, we presented this actually at, now I'm going to get the acronym wrong, but there's the Council on Global Food Security at FAO actually had a whole section on data and data rights, and a big pushback on the Gates Foundation approach to this, and looking at being more, creating contracts that actually represent individual landowners' rights, and all agricultural data shouldn't be open access. There is actually this really important consent that has to happen in order to be trusted. And we think that that's the requirement to build these public data sets that we're contributing have to start with individual consent and trust. So it's a great, you illustrate the point. This is how it works, is that you have a need and you or your organization take the time to say, this is close but isn't going to work, we need this tweak. What does this look like? We've talked a lot about the social processes. I think I'm going to actually go to the extraction question first and then come back to what it looks like. The extraction question is real. There is real common infrastructure, hardware, that's required to run communications globally. So the internet isn't just a set of protocols or agreements or technology, it's also fiber optics and processors, and those run on power, which is real. I think we can make the case that it can be far more efficient than flying people all over the world or printing presses and so forth for exchanging that. But it is real and it needs to be included as part of the transaction cost. And so some of the organizations are really looking at how do we create that toll system that we pay on an equitable basis to cover that cost. So we're building a commons infrastructure that's also supported. That gets pretty far afield from the agricultural side, but it is something where it is another sort of shared endeavor for building agricultural knowledge commons. How do we assure that we have access to that, and that access is just, and that the infrastructure being built and the system that's building it is actually also being powered in a sustainable way, and the resources that go into that. I cover a bit of this in the abundance chapter in the book, also. And what does it look like? It's a really difficult question, because depending on who you are, you experience it very differently. I mean, what does the internet look like? It's not a single thing. It's not a business model. A lot of people experience it through a web browser and a Google search engine. So I think the difference here is that we're curating it in a way that we have more control of how we experience that, and that and what comes out of that we can trust. So I think what it looks, and that includes things, a lot of where this came from was like, if you have a question about which cover crop is going to grow where, how should I price my crop? What's the right combination or order of crop rotations that's going to work best in my location, and who can I contact to help improve that? So it's access to knowledge that you trust is sort of what it looks like. Whether you type that into a box, or whether you experience that through somebody who shows up on your farm who has access to better knowledge that can walk you through a plan, whether it's through an organization like this that is able to make better recommendations in a community setting that isn't digital. I personally think that it's going to be much more conversational rather than everybody looking at their phones more often. In fact, that seems like a dystopia to me. I think one of their goals here is to actually have people experience the livelihoods in nature more by having the technology become invisible, and that our knowledge becomes culturally embedded in our rituals and in common knowledge, rather than constantly having to be connected.
And yet, if there's a void, we know that you're going to get pseudo-commons the way social media has become. And so I think that's the proactive reason why this infrastructure is imperative, to develop knowledge you can trust, because otherwise you're going to have the pseudo knowledge.
Well, and that's one of the main frustrations, not just in agriculture but in technology in general, is it's very difficult to navigate right now. You're just inundated not only with technology options, but also with a lot of advertising, a lot of pushing you in very particular directions. So I think there's what it looks like is less of that or none of that. Yeah, precisely. And so that's what organizations like Hilo are doing, is saying, how do we actually, rather than have a business model, rather than having a business model, how do we create a community platform that connects people and have more productive relationships, and can create community organizations that work better, rather than selling ads or your data.
Or that it's simply a transactional relationship, which is one-off and not trustable over the long term. I think I love the story of how couchsurfing was once this very robust social hospitality network. Now it's a market travel website. It's a very different thing. Can you put a value on that? What are the metrics for that? Well, it feels very different. The trust level is different.
Great, thank you. There's just one question from the online chat, which is a fascinating question. Are there any exciting examples of tech projects supporting nature to be a stakeholder in the decision making, i.e. giving nature a voice?
Well, there's of course the growing momentum of rights to nature laws, which it's unclear how that's going to play out in Western jurisprudence, but it is getting a serious foothold. It's in the Constitution of Ecuador. There's several dozen municipalities, states, provinces that have adopted it. And then the authors of this have developed this language for self-owning land, where a landowner can have self-owning land provisions in which an association of custodians are established to be the representatives of that land, and of course maybe the data metrics could inform that work. So there are efforts, but...
Yeah, so I'm involved with an organization called Regen Network, which is absolutely working towards creating essentially the mechanism for indigenous data about the land that's being stewarded, and there's also there are also other efforts like the intrinsic value companies that are I believe countries like Ecuador are actively involved in, and the New York Stock Exchange is actually in the process of listing these intrinsic value companies, which are again about recognizing the value of nature in its state and appreciating when nature itself increases and thrives.
With the proviso that the financialization of nature, the quantification of nature, is a very perilous path to go down, because we're seeing the securitization of nature, and that's not the same as recognizing the intrinsic value.
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily endorse that, but it is absolutely in process. So again, as you said before, part of the imperative here is we are seeing the glimpse of what happens if these processes aren't, if we don't have a counter to these. We'll see we'll see what's going to come down the pike. We have a pretty clear glimpse of that already.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions from the floor, if anybody else has anything before we wrap up. Great. Down at the front, please.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm going to be able to articulate it very well, because this is like speaking a foreign language for me.
It's like it's a very long day.
Yeah, it has actually, yeah. It's to do with our experience of using the open source technology so far, and finding that it's characterized by a kind of feeling of things being bolted on and not having a sort of a clear identity. And actually that impacting the usability of it. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that is part of the maturity of where we are in design. A lot of open source was often somebody on their own building something and saying, I did this, I want to share it. Whereas I think the evolution and what we're seeing now is that's a very different process than building a community and building something with the intention of co-designing and creating something that's maintainable by a community over time. So it's very different design considerations, and I see that as part of the evolution and maturity. And we're definitely seeing that happen. And there are a lot of different decisions that get made. And part of that is also, again, a lot of because we're borrowing so much from the software communities, they're very, like, their language is not accessible to many other people on Earth, really. So, so part of this is also starting to build bridges in usability and creating essentially ambassadors across communities that actually can perform that role, both from the land side, communicating to the communities that are building things on their behalf, but also from the technology side, who are actively engaging and understanding the needs and being a bridge. So that's a big part of what organizations like FarmHack or Open Team is recognizing, that there's a really important role in being that liaison and intermediary that over time will really radically change the way things are built and the usability and the process by which improvements are made and what the end result looks like. So I think my short answer is, it's, the fact that you're there and putting the effort in is huge, and that it shouldn't be that hard. And we can do better. and that's where the solidarity and connections across communities, that again, agriculture isn't just about farmers helping themselves. This is the recognition that designers and software engineers and musicians and artists and lawyers all have a role in actually in making this system actually work, and that it really is a shared endeavor and not just about the land stewardship, but we do it in service because there are certain people that are putting themselves out there and making it happen on the ground.
I was just thinking how the digital autonomous organization communities, which are grappling with how to be collectively cooperative, it's an interesting test case for me because so many of them are libertarian-minded and focusing on the individual as the key agent, as opposed to the collective design, and whether they come out the right end on this and have some functional commons in which they don't presume that all trust can be encoded, but there actually might have to be some real-life human being trust as part of it all. You know, so there's a number of petri dishes like that out there about whether the tech world can make the transition to these governance models in a collective design frame.
And I know we're wrapping it up and don't want to get into the can of worms, but one of the sort of the crazy connection, the nexus here in terms of trust is actually in translatability, is the role of AI in that process. Because actually one of the things, if we control it and can collectively build something that we trust, is that it has the potential to really do a good job of translating what you say in your common language into technical language. Or what you say in one language or dialect into another. That's something that we can build, and especially in agriculture, we don't actually have that many words that we're using to describe what we're doing. So it has that potential, and again, I wouldn't shy away from it because the alternative that we're gonna get if we don't work with this is gonna be far worse, and we won't have something that will work, and we will be, if we don't understand it, we will be controlled by it. So I think that's the risk here.
I wonder if, as a closing question, I could ask about about the links, coming back to some of the issues and conundrums that you posed when you first spoke, David. If you could talk to the kind of links between tech autonomy and food sovereignty, and how to empower rather than alienate smaller scale farmers, and how to resist the homogenization that you talked of, and a narrow kind of technocratic vision of the food system, techno-solutionism. That I wonder if you could, as a closing question, address this.
Well, I mean, I frankly feel a little bit pessimistic about that, because the power curve is with the standard norms and protocols and systems that come down at you. And having the expertise and resources on a local level to carve out that is frankly hard, difficult. So, I mean, I suppose theoretically it could be designed to be more adaptable, but maybe Dorn has something from his experiences that could point to how localization can be protected more or affirmatively developed.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all the questions that need to be accountable, and I think that's where creating our social contracts and design criteria and enforcing them, and I think we have a small group of people who are passionate about it, can change and create the language to create an expectation that's accepted more broadly and culturally, so that the alternative becomes unacceptable.
That's a great point. A small working example on the right side of things can just be the prototype unexpectedly for the rest of the world. You know, who knew that Occupy was going to spawn dozens of Occupy encampments? And I think the same with some of these design protocols, if they work.
Because, yeah, again, it says, why doesn't, the commercial providers are going to be asked, why, if this exists and is possible, why are you not respecting my rights? Why are you not creating what I need? Even if this solution isn't perfect yet, it shows the way and what's possible. And I think that is one of the pathways for accountability. But I mean, I think I guess, are we closing?
Yes, I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
if you want to
So,
provide some closing.
yeah, so I was just going to say that some of this, it can feel very, overwhelming in scope, and I think that's certainly, I think that's a universal feeling, but I don't think that's unique, again, to, I think we have that whether or not we apply that to agriculture. We're being inundated with a system that is out of control and out of our control. And there are many instances in history where we have pushed back. We've heard about sort of the, land reform movements. I was recently at the FAO where, the Lex Agraria was about land reform and redistribution back to yeoman farmers from the merchants and limiting the size of the operations. It was a core, and that's just feet from where the current FAO is. And the origin of the FAO, I just learned, I didn't really fully understand. My understanding of the FAO was much more in the World Bank, post-70s, which is really about commoditization and big agriculture and export agriculture. But the origins were post-colonial, or post-World War II, anti-colonist. How do we create appropriate technology? How do we map the world's soils and provide that as a method for appropriate land redistribution and creating means of production that are sustainable? And how do we create access to knowledge to build those tools locally to be able to transform and create more sovereign food and independent food systems? An incredibly ambitious agenda. And the challenge they had was that they had a printing press and they had bibliography. They could publish all these articles. We have another opportunity to take an even more bold vision for what was possible there. And if it was possible to try it in the 40s with the tools that they had, could we try it again? So I guess that's what I would sort of close with in terms of our ambitions, and that what we're on the cusp of with regenerative agriculture is really thinking about some of those same ideas and agroecology in sort of revitalizing as the method for growth and scaling and getting us out of so many social and environmental issues. And I guess I would just close with I think David Graeber says, the big secret of the world is that if it can be made, it can be remade. So our challenge is in inspiration and creating that new language for something better.
Thank you so much. Do you have any closing comments, David?
I echo that, and I just think with wary eyes open, I think we need to bravely forge into this world, or it'll be ceded to other forces. And I think that's why it's so important. And there is a huge upside, as many of Dorn's projects already demonstrate.
Thank you. And I've certainly learned a lot. We've touched on so many